Lisa, you can start.
Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. Before we do introductions, just want to make sure you know you're on a webinar provided by CCD and TAC called the HUD Section 811 PRA and Capital Advanced NOFAs. Before I hand it over to Kim, I want to make sure that everyone knows that for live captioning, you can connect with this link here. That link is in the chat box also, because it is not, I'm going to be moving the slides, so look in the chat box. If you have any issues with the captioning, please let us know through the chat box. Thank you. Kim.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. I just want to do a few housekeeping updates with you all. Everyone has joined the webinar muted except for our presenters today. If you have questions during the webinar, there's a question box, and we will get to them as soon. The question box is on the right-hand side of your screen. Sorry about that. And you can enter your question, and we'll get to them as soon as possible during the webinar. If you have any questions in regards to technology, I can answer those questions as soon as you put them in the question box, or you feel free to use the chat function. Lisa, you're all set.
Thank you. Just going to go back to this slide to make sure everyone knows that this is a presentation by CCD and TAC. We're not from HUD, nor do we represent HUD. HUD has not endorsed or reviewed the presentation. The goal of the presentation is simply to encourage successful applications to Section 811 NOFAs, and this presentation is no way a substitute for careful review of the NOFA itself. The links below will get you to the NOFA page for each of the webinars. HUD has recently held a NOFA webinar for the PRA program, and will be holding one for the Capital Advance in January. So in terms of any kinds of technical questions, that's really where you want to go, not to this webinar. Thank you. Molly?
Hi, everyone, and good afternoon. Thanks for joining this webinar today. I'm Molly Bergdorf. I'm the Director of Rights Policy at the ARC of the United States, and I'm also co-chair of the CCD Housing Task Force. That's the Consortium for Citizens with Disabilities Housing Task Force. And if you could please advance the slide, Lisa, I'll just touch very briefly on our purpose, which is CCD is the largest coalition of national organizations working together to advocate for federal public policy to ensure the self-determination, independence, empowerment, integration, and inclusion of children and adults with disabilities in all aspects of society. And we're offering this webinar today in the context that, as we know, across the nation, people with disabilities face a crisis in the availability of decent, safe, affordable, and accessible housing. And HUD recently offered $112 million toward expanding the supply of permanent affordable housing for very low-income persons with disabilities. That's their language. So we wanted to make sure that we were sharing an introduction and appropriate information about the opportunity for applying for this funding, and to make sure that there were strong proposals that HUD received. And today we'll go into the agenda, but we're covering, as Lisa already mentioned, two components of this funding. So it's Section 811 project rental assistance. The deadline for that is February 10th, 2020, and the Section 811 capital advance funding opportunity, which is now due March 10th, 2020. And you'll hear this again, but those are two important deadlines. We want to make sure to help facilitate participation from disability organizations for as strong as applications as possible. And I think with that, I will turn it back over to Lisa.
Thanks, Molly. So this slide is a little bit of an agenda so you know what we're planning to cover today. We're going to do a little bit of background on the 811 program, and then we're going to talk about the PRA program that Molly just mentioned and the NOFA. Then we'll move on to the Capital Advance PRAC program and the NOFA opportunity there. And then we'll go back to some of the advocacy opportunities that some of you on the line may be interested in. And we hope to finish up with plenty of time for Q&A. Again, not so much real technical Q&A. That is something that you're going to really want to look to HUD for. Okay. So let's start with a little bit of 811 background. The slide that you see right there is the definition of is language from the statute as to what the supportive housing program with people with disabilities, or the 811 program, is conceived of by Congress. And as you can see, the purpose of the section or the program is to enable persons with disabilities to live with dignity and independence within their communities by expanding the supply of supportive housing that is designed to accommodate any special needs of such persons, make available supportive housing and as needed, and promoting and facilitating community integration. Before 1992, when the 811 program was established, these activities were funded through another program called the Section 202 program, and that program developed housing for both seniors and people with disabilities, sometimes collaborative ventures and sometimes separate, but they were all through the 202 program. In 1992, they split the populations. Section 202 only develops housing for people over age 62, and 811 is specifically for people between the ages of 18 and 61 before you become 62. Historically, the 811 program initially produced 3,000 or more units a year, but over time, by 2010, the number of units produced was, a fifth of that, 600 to 800 units created annually. And that seemed to be because Congress thought the program had a high per unit cost. It was not necessarily developing a lot of what we would maybe say was integrated housing. It didn't have a linkage to state affordable or disability policy housing, or kind of the direction services were going in, and so demand and appropriations declined. CCD was very concerned about that and led a 3-year campaign for reform of the 811 program, and what the Reform Act is called the Frank Melville Supportive Housing Investment Act of 2010, and that act added the project rental assistance component that we're going to talk about in a second, as well as a multifamily integrated housing option that is similar to what HUD has included this year as part of the Capital Advance program. So it expanded the ways in which the Melville Act could be used to create integrated housing for people with disabilities. Since the passage into 10, I think it was really signed in January of 11, CCD has campaigned for funding for the program. There has not always been funding for the new units. There was funding in 12, 13, and 14, and then no money until 17 and 18 again, or 17, 18, or maybe 18, 19. All of these different programs provide affordable rental housing for people with disabilities. They just achieve this goal through different kinds of financing and different kinds of actual models in the community. So the goal, as we already said, the goal of this webinar is to really do outreach to the community so everyone is aware of these opportunities and can encourage application to use the funds that are here in your communities as needed and as appropriately as possible, and to show, potentially how much need there is out there so that perhaps Congress will continue to provide funding for new units. My understanding is there is no new unit funding in the budget that was just put out yesterday. So let's start with, we're going to talk about two different programs. The Section 811 Project Rental Assistance, or PRA program, will be the first program. So let's talk about that first. I'm going to talk a little bit about this in a second, but I want to be clear with the folks listening to this that the only eligible applicants for this program, PRA, are state housing agencies. and you'll see why in a second. The only applicants eligible for the Capital Advance NOFA, which we'll talk about after this, are nonprofit applicants who have the capacity to do the development. It might be a nonprofit developer, might be a nonprofit provider, but there are two different entities can apply. That said, you may be listening not so much to be an applicant, but or you may be interested in one or not the other, but it's important for everyone in the community to help advocate for these units to be accessed for people in your community. So if you're not a state housing agency, that doesn't mean you shouldn't listen to the next couple of slides. We hope that you will find out whether in the state you're in has the PRA program, and if not, maybe you'll go with your organization and advocate for an application from the state in response to this NOFA so that people living in your community have an opportunity to use this resource. Similarly, if you're from the state, we hope that you'll listen to the nonprofit component and think about nonprofits that you work with that might be appropriate applicants, eligible applicants. So just trying to make sure everybody's thinking about how they can relate to these important resources. So I want to start with we're talking about the PRA program. I want to start with a tiny bit of background, a little bit of level setting. So what PRA provides rental assistance. So rental assistance pays the difference between what a tenant can afford and the actual cost of the unit. So in the example up here, and in right now, so far, in the federal programs and most of the state programs we all work with, generally, affordability means tenant pays 30% of their income for rent and utilities. It's a tough market out there, and in some cases, people are paying 40%. It's being considered affordable under some programs, but we're really talking about having people pay 30% of their income for rent and utilities, and that's what happens in the PRA program. So in the examples you see up here, Sam's income, the SAM is income is only SSI, that's their sole source, so it's about $771 per month. There's no state supplement for that, for SAM. 30% of SAM's income is $231 a month, but the rent for the unit that we're talking about is $1,000. So SAM pays what SAM can afford, which is $231, and rental assistance, which makes up the difference, which is $769. That's the piece that the government is paying to the landlord to enable SAM to live in this unit. Rental assistance can be tenant-based or project-based. If it's tenant-based, it's like the program people think about as Section 8 program or Housing Choice Voucher program. An individual takes a voucher and picks an apartment and sees if they can rent that apartment. Project-based means that rental assistance is attached to the unit. When you move into the unit, the individual tenant receives the rental assistance subsidy, but if that person moves out, they can't take it with them. It stays with the unit, okay? The Section 811 PRA program, the rental assistance that we're talking about, that subsidy to make an expensive unit affordable to someone who has an extremely low income, that subsidy is project-based. The funding's tied to the unit. Here's how the PRA program works. HUD, the U.S. Department of Housing and Urban Development, provides 811 PRA funding to state housing agencies through a competitive NOFA process like the one we're talking about today. Then those state housing agencies, they award the rental assistance funds to eligible multifamily properties, to apartment complexes that either are required because of the way they got money from the state or are interested in providing integrated housing for people with disabilities. No more than 25% of the units in the property are allowed to have PRA or other disability restrictions. That is the way Congress wrote it in order to try to make for an integrated multifamily property. And you can't use the money for capital. in other words, to develop or construct. It only can be used for rental assistance, and the state gets a little bit of admin. Those are the only two eligible uses. So the developer has to identify any needed capital, so for repairs or upgrades or new construction, from other sources. And as we said, the goal is to provide integrated housing for people with disabilities. So once this apartment is available, a PRA unit is funded, who's eligible for the PRA units? Who's allowed to live in those units? And this slide shows you who can live there. The applicant must be, or the tenant must be, a person with a disability between ages 18 and 62. They have to have an extremely low income, which means 30% of AMI, area median income. People who are on SSI, and most people with who are recipients of SSDI are likely to meet that. The individual has to be eligible for community-based long-term services, such as those provided through Medicaid waivers. However, the services have to be available, but they are available on a voluntary basis, meaning they are not required. There's nothing in the lease that says you have to use the services. You just have to be eligible for them. And the goal is to target this resource to people who would otherwise have a hard time living in the community, both because they have low incomes and because that they probably need some kind of independent living services, tenancy supports to be able to live in the community. Again, available but not required. Some states that run this program may have other requirements or preferences. So, for example, there might be people coming from institutions may be served before other people, maybe higher on the waiting list, or people who are homeless, or both. States have done all kinds of other things. But that really manages the waiting list. Those first four bullets is what makes someone eligible for a unit. One of the things that's unique about the PRA program is that the statute requires a state partnership. This is a statutory requirement, and you see that reflected in the NOFA we'll talk about in a second. There has to be a state partnership between the state housing agency, the state Medicaid agency, the state human service agency, and this has to be written in an agreement, and the agreement has to describe who's the program going to serve, who's your target population for your state, and how are you going to find those persons and refer them to units. And HUD wants to see, and Congress wanted to see, a commitment of services that would be available, again, on a voluntary basis. So the partnership agreement has to be include all of those three components. The partnership agreement, as I said, is a statutory requirement, and it is a threshold requirement for this application. Let's talk about today. That's a little background on the program. Or I guess describing where we are first. In May 2012, HUD published the first PRA NOFA, and they made awards to 12 states totaling $98 million. In March of 14, HUD published the second NOFA and awarded $150 million to 24 states. So right now, 27 states, because there was some overlap between those two, the awards provided in those first two NOFAs, 27 different states administer the program with more than almost 6,000, more than 5,900 units anticipated out of their awards. There was a lot of interest the first time around. 43 states plus the District of Columbia submitted applications previously, and you can see the link. There's a link there to HUD has a web page on HUD Exchange specifically about the 811 PRA program. So a NOFA is now available. As Molly indicated, there was $112 million in the previous appropriations, and HUD divided that into $37 million for the PRA program and $75 million for the Capital Advance program. For the PRA program, states can apply for a maximum of $7 million per award, And the awards, as I said, are for rental assistance plus a little bit of admin. And the amount of rental assistance that is awarded is for 5 years' worth. So however many units the state thinks they can do, they will get 5 years' worth of money. Those applications are due to HUD on February 10th, 2020. This past week, HUD held, last week or this week? Last week, HUD held a webinar. It was recorded and it will be posted, and you can see the link there to which you will be able to access those slides and the webinar if you were not able to see it and you're interested in that. Okay, we're going to move on. So before we talk about the Capital Advance Program, again, all kinds of people are listening. If you're an advocate in a state that received funds in the 12 or the 13 competitions that already happened, you know, we hope you're working with state officials to support implementation of the program and encouraging states that have used all their money to apply for this new round. If your state doesn't have this program, hopefully you can reach out to your state housing or Medicaid or human service agencies and encourage them to complete an application this round so those resources are available to your community. One of the things that you might find helpful around that advocacy is the link here on HUD's Exchange PRA website. There are some videos and stories from some of the states that are already running programs that have been used recently to kind of gin up local support with developers and property managers, so you might find those useful for the same purpose. We're going to move on to the Capital Advance Program, and then we'll do some questions at the end. I think we're moving along pretty quickly. I think hopefully we'll have time for plenty of questions. So the other NOFA that's out is for a different component of the 811 program, the 811 Capital Advance PRAC. Again, we're going to talk about this in a second, but the only eligible applicants for these funds are nonprofit organizations. So what's a capital advance? Very, you know, funny term if you're not used to this program. You haven't, there has not been money for quite a while, so under this component. So a capital advance, these are funds that are used to finance a project. It could be new construction, rehabilitation, or to acquire land or property. There is no interest on these funds that are provided to the developer, and if the housing remains available for very low-income people with disabilities for at least 40 years, the capital advance does not have to be repaid. If after 20 years, for example, the housing use was going to be changed, then there would have to be some repayment to HUD, and that has happened, and HUD has some sort of formula that it uses. So remember, this is a capital advance PRAC. First half of the funds that are provided under this NOFA is that capital advance to build or acquire a building. In addition, the developer gets PRAC. PRAC stands for Project Rental Assistance Contract, and that's a contract between the owner who received the capital advance and HUD. And through this contract, HUD provides the owner with funds every year to cover the difference between the tenant's contribution towards rent and the HUD-approved operating costs. Now, that sounds a lot like PRA, right? But it's a little bit different. I think for those of you who are sort of tenant advocates, it's going to be pretty much the same. But for developers, it's going to feel a little bit different. What's the same? The same is how much the tenant pays for rent. The calculation is the same. It's the same formula, and the tenant is generally going to pay 30% of their income for rent and utilities. The other thing that's the same is this is project-based operating assistance. It's not money that, like a tenant-based voucher that moves. It's attached to the property. You live in the unit, you get the subsidy, you move out, the subsidy stays there for the next person. But what's different? So the PRA program pays up to the fair market rent, or a rent that's determined through a market study. PRAC pays only up to the amount needed to operate the property for things like maintenance, security, utilities, taxes, putting some money aside so that you can fix the roof in 5 years. But it doesn't include payment towards debt service. And so it's not paying a fair market rent. It's paying what is generally a lower rent. And that's because HUD's already given you some money for capital, so they don't expect to pay a mortgage if they've already paid for some capital for that property. So that's why there's a difference there. So how does the Capital Advance PRAC program work? It is different than the way the PRA program works. So HUD provides the capital advance to an eligible nonprofit developer, and not by nonprofit we really mean a 501c3 nonprofit, through a competitive NOFA process like the one that we're talking about today. So the relationship in the PRA program, HUD gives the money to the state gives the money to the developer. Here, the money goes directly from HUD to the developer. That's the relationship. It's a little bit different. There are 3 eligible project types in the NOFA. The first is integrated housing, and that's very much like the PRA model, where there's a multifamily, like an apartment building, and a multifamily complex, 5 or more units, in which no more than 25% of the units are for people with disabilities, and those 25% could potentially get the capital advance and PRAC. So that's one model. And you can also do condominium units, which are essentially have the same requirements as integrated housing. It's just with condo units, you may be purchasing, instead of having a rental apartment building in which you own the whole building, and some of the units are targeted to people with disabilities, that the developer may, in a big condominium complex of, let's say, 100 units, buy 20 units through the Capital Advance program and owns 20 individual units in the complex. So it's a different kind of deal from the developer's perspective, but from the tenant's perspective, it's a similar kind of experience. The third, and similar rules apply between condominium and integrated from HUD's perspective. The third project type is the group home, in which 100% of the units can be for people with disabilities. But HUD warns in their NOFA that the group home has to be in accordance with the state's transition plan, and that has to be consistent with the Home and Community-Based Services final rule, the settings rule, as well as any kind of Olmstead settlement agreements that a state may have. So group homes are allowed, but the kind of size and model and other kinds of things that are addressed in your state's transition plan have to be consistent both with your transition plan and with the final settings rule. So, and you have to provide HUD with a letter from your Medicaid office indicating that consistency. So that's a little bit of a difference. Another important piece of the Capital Advance PRAC program and this NOFA is that site control is required. So HUD really wants to get these units up and available for people. They don't want to wait. So this is going to make it hard. The timing's a little tough for this program for some developers, but for some developers it's perfect timing. Partnership and leveraging are encouraged. Things that are kind of required in the PRA program are encouraged here but not required. HUD understands that to the extent that services need to be available, the partnership has to make them available, but there's no interagency partnership agreement here as there is a threshold requirement in the PRA program. In the PRA program, the developer has to leverage the capital here, at least some of the capital is provided, although it's likely not 100%. The developer's probably going to have to leverage some from somewhere, but it's set up a little bit differently. So who is eligible for these units once they're online, once the developer makes them available? Very similar to the PRA, but a little bit different. You have to be a person with a disability. You have to be between ages 18 and 62. The income is a little bit different. You have to have a very low income. For PRA, it was extremely low, which means 30% of AMI. This is very low income, which means 50% of AMI. Just to give you some perspective, if most people whose sole source of income is SSI, they have incomes at about 20% of AMI or less. So they're under PRA and certainly under the eligibility for this program. So very low income. Like the PRA program, HUD has put out a capital advance PRAC NOFA. As I said before, there's $75 million available for the NOFA, and the maximum award is $2.5 million per project. They expect to make approximately 25 to 30 awards from the funds available, but HUD and they also had a target under the PRA program. I can't remember, but HUD doesn't really know how many applications it's going to get. So they're kind of guessing, but they have not had funds for the capital advance since 2010. So they are not, it's almost 10 years later, they're not really sure how many awards to expect this time around. That first link there is for their NOFA page for this, for Capital Advance PRAC NOFA. Their webinar has not taken place yet for this program. It's going to be held in January 2020, January 15th, and the link will get you to the way you can register for that NOFA if you're interested. Applications for this program are due a month later. They got backed up with the webinar, so they decided to push out the application due date to March 10th instead of February 10th, which it was originally. Advocacy opportunities. One thing that's a little bit different this time than 2010 and the earlier NOFAs is that this is really because of the integrated housing model that is new for this NOFA. Nonprofit developers that use the tax credit program or home funds or National Housing Trust Fund dollars in your state might be working on a project that's a good match for this program, either because they already committed to doing some units there for housing for people with disabilities, or because they would be interested and willing to because they could use some money to make their deal work better. So there really is some advocacy opportunity around that. So those are our slides for today. I think we can see if folks have any questions. I'm going to open up the question box. I don't see any right now.
Lisa,
yep.
Sorry, this is Molly. I just wondered, did you mention the rollover of PRA funds to Capital Advance?
No, I did not. So
okay.
What Molly's talking about is that HUD took the $112 million it had and divided $37 million for PRA and $75 million for Capital Advance. The PRA NOFA says if there's extra money in that NOFA, or the Capital Advance NOFA says that if there's extra money in the PRA NOFA, it can come into the Capital Advance, but it doesn't say the opposite. It doesn't say if there's any extra capital money, it can go to the PRA program. It's not clear whether that was intentional or a mistake, and we'll see if through FAQs HUD says anything about that. They may make a comment about that, Molly. I think we'll have to wait and see. There are no FAQs up on HUD's website yet. So this is a muted call. If you do have questions or comments, please put those in the question box. Why don't we give it, looks like we have a question. Could either NOFA be used for renovation or rehab? Either yes. The answer is yes. It's just either NOFA could be used with a project that involves renovation or rehab, but the PRA NOFA, the first one, will only provide, they would pay for, if you renovate a building, you would take, you take a mortgage out, then the PRA money could pay the mortgage. It doesn't give you, there's no capital money directly. The capital advance project, NOFA, is one that for which you could use the capital directly for renovation and rehab. Okay, so it's kind of indirect in the PRA program, but it's direct in the capital advance. But it's both are a project that is a rehab is eligible, if that makes sense. Our regional, we got another question, and if there's a follow-up to that, please yell. We got another question. Are regional centers as nonprofits only eligible to apply for the capital advance? If by regional centers, when we say nonprofit, we mean 50C3 or 50C3 incorporated organizations. The term regional center, in my experience, applies to a public entity, but in the ones I'm familiar with. Molly, what do you think about that?
I'm sorry, I don't actually have access to the questions, so
oh,
I think.
No, okay. But most regional centers are they are kind of publicly funded organizations? No.
Well, my answer to the question, as I understood it, is it's not just limited to regional centers. Are regional centers eligible? I think is a separate question, but it's certainly not limited only to that type of entity.
Yep, it's not limited to that type of entity. I would just think that regional centers for people with IDD may not be eligible at all because they are not so let me back up for a second because there are sort of two embedded questions. Nonprofit agencies are eligible to receive PRA funds, the first NOFA I talked about, in states that the state housing agency has funding. So nonprofits can't apply to HUD for money, but if your state has PRA, a nonprofit can get it. In contrast, a nonprofit can apply directly to HUD for the capital advance. Okay, so that's one part of the question. The second part is, are regional centers for individuals with IDD nonprofits? I think you need to check and look at the NOFA for the definition. I'm not sure that they meet the actual definition. You should check. New question.
Okay.
Who can apply for 811 vouchers? How and when is the deadline again? Sure. So none of these are vouchers. So there's a totally separate kind of program, that's sometimes called 811, but is really mostly called the mainstream program. And those are tenant-based vouchers, and those housing authorities apply for. And there is no NOFA out right now for those. There will be one in 2020, but there isn't one now. For the PRA program are project-based rental assistance, which is like a voucher, but it's project-based. And those state housing agencies are eligible to apply for that program. And they can apply through the HUD NOFA. And the deadline for that is February 10th. Kim, can we attach the slides? Can people get the slides from their, the box on the right, or should we send them out after?
We're going to have to send them out afterwards, Lisa. In order for people to have access to the slides now, they would have had to been uploaded before the webinar.
Okay, so we'll send them out to everybody who registered after the fact, and you will then be able to use the links that we had in the slides, which you moved too fast to copy down. Okay, any other questions? Give it another minute.
This is Molly. Before we go, are there topics related to these funding opportunities that folks want to know more about? Or did you get your fill?
So you want to have people put that in the question box if they have ideas for other things that they're interested in hearing about?
Yes, particularly if it would help make a determination about whether they would either apply or support a state's application. Just because we have a little bit of lead time until the due date. So we want to try to provide resources that are helpful.
Good idea. Question, why did 811 start limiting to age 62? Why? In the late 80s, so historically, this is a long answer, but historically, HUD in public housing, as well as this multifamily program we're talking about, the agency as a whole really funded two kinds of development. Family housing, which had no age limit, but tended to have larger size units like 2, 3s, and 4s, and elderly housing, for which 1-bedroom units, for which people with disabilities were eligible, but really didn't kind of know that or use it a lot for a long time until the 80s. And then when states got more focused on helping people move into the community and away from institutionalization, then people looked for opportunities in the community to live, and this was an opportunity. So in the 80s, a lot of people with disabilities moved into what some people thought of as quote-unquote elderly housing, even though people with disabilities who were younger were eligible for it. By the late 1980s, that had created there were a lot of kerfuffles all over the country around people with disabilities and younger people with disabilities living with seniors. There was a lot of conflict about that, and the way Congress dealt with they did a lot of things. But in this program, one of the things they did was to create they said, okay, as of 1990, the 202 program is for seniors, and by that we mean people 62 and older, and we're creating this new program called the 811 program, and that's for people between the ages 18 and 62. So that is my understanding of why things are the way they are. So hopefully that was helpful. Someone is typing in a question. So this is a person with a disability who had, it sounds like, some sort of housing choice voucher through their town, and then they were offered a voucher through the state, but they had to give up their town. So you can't have two vouchers at the same time. So if you have one and you choose to pick another, you'd have to give it up. And that sounds like what happened in your situation. But it sounds like you got put in a difficult position. Okay. It sounds like you were not able to use the Housing Choice Voucher because the payment standard wasn't enough, that the housing in your area was too expensive and you couldn't find a location. That's unfortunate. Your question, your question is, are these considered Section 811? There are, no, those are probably not 811. There are vouchers called mainstream vouchers, and for some reasons I won't go into, some people call them 811 mainstream vouchers, but they are not this program that we're talking about today. They're different. Thank you. Any other questions? Somebody wants to know, how do you apply for 811? Generally, HUD has on its website, if you Googled HUD rental housing, you would pop up a drop-down box where you could search in your state and in a particular community, and part of what would pop up, it's all the HUD-funded housing, including 811. For some reason, that is not online right now. When you Google it, it says we're fixing the site or something. You can't get that information. Hopefully that will change soon, but that is primarily how you'd find out is through HUD's rental housing or apartment search. I think they call it an apartment search on their website. So I would say after January 1st, try again, see if it's up. Google HUD apartment search, and you should be able to find places in your community. Any other questions? Let's see. Someone asked, can you get reimbursement for making your apartment accessible for out-of-pocket expenses under the Section 811 program? No. An individual couldn't, for sure. A nonprofit, if they were making a building accessible, some of those costs could be covered under the Capital Advance program. Another question, if a person is 62 or under when they enter 811, would they need to leave after they turn 63? No. Once you're in the 811, once an individual is a tenant in a program, your income can go up, your age can go up, and you remain eligible. There's a point at which if your income goes up so much, you would be basically paying a market rent. There would be no subsidy, but no, once you are a tenant, as long as you are a good tenant, and I mean by that you pay your rent on time, you keep your unit, neat and clean, you don't have police coming to the apartment, you are entitled to stay. It's a permanent housing program. Anybody else? Okay, I think that was the last question. Molly, would you like to take us out?
Just like to thank everyone for joining us today, and feel free to follow up. It sounded like there was potentially a specific question about somebody's situation, and you are always free to contact me. I'm at bergdorf@thearc.org. That's BURG DORF@thearc.org, and just wanting to root on folks supporting their state housing authority in the case of the PRA NOFA or the capital advance to really try to take advantage of this, and we're happy to try to support those efforts however we can. And I wish you peaceful and refreshing holidays and a happy new year.
Thanks.